Hello and welcome to What It Is, the show of conversations on music news, history, and culture. I'm Joe Kendrick, very glad to be your host once again. This is brought to you by Independent Arts and Music of Asheville on imavl.com. We're broadcasting live today from Echo Mountain Recording Studios in downtown Asheville, North Carolina. Very special What It Is today. It is our special all-women's panel, also all veterans of What It Is, as we welcome Kim Rule of No Depression magazine, also Carol Rifkin, who is at WNCW for This Old Porch, as well as a writer at the Asheville Citizen-Times, as well as a performer in Paul's Creek Band. We welcome Caitlin Crisco of The Broadcast, also Aaron Scholes of Dream Spider Publicity, and festival manager at Music Allies and Creative Allies, Amy Jones. And today our show, we explore iconic and heroic women in music history, also publicity, promotions, social media, all those ways that you as an artist and as a fan can get noticed today. Starting out our show about iconic and heroic women in music history with Kim Rule, I wanted to talk a little bit, Kim, about your book that you're working on Zilphia Horton, who could possibly be the most heroic figure in our talk today, but possibly one of the least well-known.
Yeah. Zilphia was a musicologist and a musician, teacher, activist, organizer in the hills of central Tennessee in the 1930s through the 50s. And the way I found Zilphia was by way of a fascination with the topical song movement of the 1950s and the 60s, where which wasn't exactly teeming with women. I mean, we had Joan Baez, who was doing incredible work with topical and traditional folk songs, but other than that, we had Bob Dylan, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger. All of these people were impacted in incredible ways by Zilphia Horton, who came 20 years before them and started digging up all these traditional old folk songs, sort of honing in on the spirit of the songs and the universal humanity and truths of the songs, and rewriting them for use in the labor movement. That was the beginning of her career, but where she worked at the Highlander Folk School in Monteagle, Tennessee, they started having integrated meetings about civil rights in the early 1940s. So by the time the civil rights movement really blew up with Brown versus Board of Education and the Montgomery bus boycott in 54 and 55, Zilphia had already been singing songs like Keep Your Eyes on the Prize and We Shall Not Be Moved and We Shall Overcome with activists for decades at that point.
So Zilphia is an incredible story, with her life of literally being shot at for marching down the street in a protest march to a rather tragic death. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit more about some of those aspects.
Well, she tells a story about, and I take the story with a grain of salt because I think Zilphia and her husband Miles were both fans of telling tall tales in order to make a point. But but there was a march on Washington's birthday somewhere in Arkansas in the late 1930s that Zilphia attended, and she tells a story as the history of the song We Shall Not Be Moved. The whole town was on strike pretty much. It was one of those old boom towns where the industry came to town, built a town and for its workers, and then basically owned the workers and kept them under the thumb. And so the workers organized and called Highlander and had them come out to help them organize, and they had this parade on Washington's birthday. And the town preacher was in the parade, the high school marching band was in the parade, and they're making their way down the street when 40 machine gun bullets rang into the crowd, and everybody ducked out. And Zilphia tells a story about how she looked down in a ditch and a cop was lying there covering himself. And she said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Hell, lady, I got a wife and 3 kids. I got to protect myself." And
what year was that?
This was probably 35, 36,
wow,
according to her story. And so she led them in singing We Shall Not Be Moved, and people started to come out and join in the song, and they just stood there and were not moved and were not, intimidated by the violence and the oppression from the bosses.
Musicians. Wasn't she like a camp where everyone from New York, the reason they knew those songs is because they went down and hung out with her, and they learned them there.
Yeah, but the school was the Highlander Folk School. Now it's called the Highlander Research and Education Center, and it's in Newmarket, Tennessee, about an hour away from here. And it was a residential school for adults that people came to for weeks-long workshops. Some of the workshops lasted months, where people would come from across the South to learn how to organize a union, how to do Robert's Rules of Order, how to do accounting and bookkeeping. And they also learned how to rethink the world around them, how to use their culture and the things that were already strong in their world, like the food, the dance, the music, in order to organize communities and demand social change. So and this is something that's still, they're still doing this 80 years later.
So she was really the first female vocalist to ever utilize music as a way to unite people.
Yeah. There's this photo that's up right there is her leading singing of a Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, meeting, where she's having them sing probably something like "We Shall Not Be Moved" or some of these. She took songs like Dixie and changed the words so that it was about empowering you to organize to demand a fair wage or safer working conditions. And these tactics of using music, rewriting music, teaching people that they can just make up new words if they didn't agree with what the words already said, implicitly taught people that if you can change the songs, you can change anything, really. Once you feel everybody around you singing words that you've made up, you can just imagine what it would be like to live in a world that you've helped make up.
Did she change the words to Red Wing? Is she the one who did the one that became the Union Maid? There once was a Union Maid. That's actually an old traditional fiddle tune called Red Wing that's real popular.
I wouldn't be surprised. She had thousands of words in her collection. Thousands of songs in her collection. There's versions of My Country 'Tis of Thee that were aimed at the labor movement.
Interesting.
And she actually learned a little known fact. She actually learned a song called. It was originally called "I'll Be Alright Someday." It was an old African American spiritual that had been, older than that even. But she learned it from a woman named Lucille Simmons, who is an African American union activist in the Food and Tobacco Workers Union in Charleston, South Carolina. They had a 5-month-long strike in 1945. If you can just I'm constantly trying to wrap my head around being an African American woman in Charleston, South Carolina in 1945
for 5 months protesting
and standing up and saying, "I deserve a better conditions at my job." That's just daring.
It's amazing.
But 5 months into this, they started singing this hymn, "I'll Be Alright Someday," and it was all about throw anything you want at me in this earthly life, and I'm gonna die and go to heaven. I'll be okay. But she taught this song. Lucille Simmons taught this song to Zilphia, and Zilphia said, "Well, how about if we use this song as forget heaven, let's make this a song about what we can do here," and turn it into "We Will Overcome." 1946. Taught the song to Pete Seeger a year later. Pete Seeger popularized it. Guy Carawan taught it to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee 13 years later.
Wow.
And that point, 1960, with Guy Carawan, was the point that people generally consider "We Shall Overcome" became important. But again, she had been singing it for 13 years and teaching people this song. It's just an incredible. I could go on.
She must have been really unpopular in the rural South at that place and time, or if not unpopular, a scary thing. Pete Seeger came to the mountains he bought his long neck banjo from a man on Bascom Lamar Lunsford's front porch when he was 17.
Mm-hmm.
And he's told me this story several times. And the reason we don't normally see long neck banjos around here.
Mm-hmm.
He said, he sold this Rube, the banjo he had with the neck that's too long, and now people all over the United States play long neck banjos. But I would have, even Pete Seeger, I know, the people were very polite to him. They were that was another world, a world of power that they were kind of really afraid. She must have really intimidated people, or
Well, the funny thing is she absolutely did not intimidate anyone.
Oh, really?
And, you know, I've talked to a lot of people who knew her and worked with her and were students of at Highlander or knew the Hortons in some way. A lot of people were very mad and intimidated by or irritated by Miles Horton, her husband. But Zilphia was this warm, not matronly, I guess. I mean, she was motherly, very nurturing presence, very warm presence. And I've asked people, did Zilphia have any enemies? Did anybody who did she not get along with? And they'll say, well, she never quite liked people who made fun of Southerners or who made fun of mountain people as being stupid and illiterate, and like that was and like illiteracy means that you have no power in the world, you know, like it angered her that people thought that about Southerners and mountain people, but she didn't necessarily anger people. You know, she was a very warm figure, and that was a lot of her power as a teacher was that she was able to just by her presence inspire people to reconsider the way they considered their culture. You know?
It brings to mind that it doesn't seem that there are very many women like this now, or even songs like this now. It seems like, to me anyway, maybe you can enlighten me as to what might be going on currently as far as protest music or civil rights music and music of the people. It just doesn't seem to be all that prevalent.
I would say it's not. In terms of pop culture and mainstream music, I would say definitely not. But I don't necessarily know that that is a result of musicians not creating music like that. I would say that that may be more along the lines of the industries and corporations that run the radio stations are not giving people the accessibility to that style of music because it could potentially be dangerous if you really think about it, to them at least, maybe. And, you know, we could even discuss that later as we go on to, like, the progression of women in the music industry and how that image has changed over time. And even just hearing about Zilphia and the way that she used music, like, it's incredible how inspiring to hear about a woman really empowering the spirit of music to create a sense of community amongst the people, and in a sense of empowerment to the community that could otherwise not empower themselves. Mm-hmm. And I think there is still music like that. I just think it's harder to access because of the limitations in media these days in terms of how you can get your music on the radio or on TV or in those ways. You know what I mean?
She took a lot of classic songs that were already great. It's not that easy to write a classic great hit. I mean, she took the best
no
ones.
Kidding.
She took all the best ones.
There's
really.
A song, you get a line and I'll get a pole, honey. You get a line and I'll get a pole, babe. And she's sort of like
Griffith show.
This was a very popular song at the time, and she sort of like honed in on, like, if you really listen to what the song is about, it's you get your tool and I'll get my tool. We'll come back together and use what we have to, you know, do something that'll benefit both of us. It's a work song. It's a labor song. Even though, like, in the day it wasn't considered that.
Right.
But like she sort of like wrenched that meaning out of it, and then they changed the words to be like, if the banker gets in the way, honey.
Yeah.
You know, and it turned into this whole labor hymn. That
Interesting.
Was, you know.
They're not that easy to write either. Somebody called me about a month ago and asked me if I wouldn't like to write a song about, they said, you've been writing a lot of songs. I like your last CD. Can you write a song about water? Because we're concerned about the state of the water. Would you write, and I live at Paul's Creek, so could you write a song about water? I've tried to write a song about water for a while now.
Sure. Well,
and I keep waiting for the lightning bolt to strike me that's going to make the song leap onto my napkin somewhere.
Well,
but
because the only way to make,
to
make a song, to bring to light any kind of social issue or to evoke a spirit of protest in people, the lyrics have to be really authentic, and they can't come from an inauthentic place. Like, that passion has to be from like a place of like inside of yourself, you know what I'm saying? So like maybe if you're not really that passionate about saving the water,
hey, Paul's Creek is totally authentic. Paul's Creek is totally
I just
authentic,
mean more
and I
along the lines
love
of
it.
like you can't fight a war for something you don't really believe in, and if you try to, people can smell that stuff from a mile away.
Well,
You know
There's
what I
the
mean?
whole
Sophia
concept of
used to-
sentence structure and word use and choruses and all that.
Sophie used to tell people, and this is one of my favorite quotes, was that she'd say, I don't care if people have one nationality or one religion. There's only one thing they have to have before they can sing together, and that is that they believe in something.
Yeah.
And that was such a powerful, I mean, and she was focusing on getting non-musicians to sing.
That's great.
Which is what Pete Seeger has built his entire career, and he's 94 now, on that concept. And he met Sophia when he was traveling across the country with Woody Guthrie when he was like dropping out of Harvard and wanted to, you know, be on the road with folk singer.
But just encouraging people to use their voice is something that is it is generationless. I think that it is just as applicable to 2013 as it was back then. It's just that what an amazing gift that we have as performers and as musicians to be able to encourage others to use their voice, to truly use their voice, both literally and figuratively speaking. I think that that's a message that will never, ever get old in the society that we live in, for sure.
I disagree with that a little bit with that because music to me is just a joy that happens. There's not all that thought behind it in most of the music that I, you know, I've always played or whatever. I understand what she was saying and how she did a great use with it, but I think for an awful lot of musicians it's just a great joy that you can do. It just happens spontaneously and perhaps not with any thought whatsoever about the content of the words or whatever.
I'm like, I literally drown in the content of our music.
Yeah.
It's like, that is to me, and it goes to show, like, even in our band, like, I've got certain band members where, you know, they'll say like, oh, lyrics, schmerics, like, who cares, like, it doesn't matter, and I'm like, no,
it matters,
you don't understand, this one word could change the whole phrase, and like, what are we talking about in this? And like, for me, at least for a very large portion of, I think, why I'm driven to do what I do is it is really amazing, and it does offer me a lot of joy, but I do feel this like innate sense of responsibility to be a representation for women in the music industry that's different than what they're being offered right now. I guess, and it could maybe be just like, I wasn't lucky enough growing up in the music industry and pop culture to have influential, strong women to like look up to and to feel inspired by. And so I guess maybe growing up I had this sense of like revolution inside of me to sort of change that image of women in music that's been existing since I've sort of stepped into the music industry. You know what I mean?
Historically, you'd kind of have to get in line.
Yeah.
You're not the first
I
one
know.
to feel that way.
No, I know. I'm not the first in line, but I also think it's a very scary time in current music that there aren't enough women that are stepping up to the plate to do that in pop culture and in mainstream music. And we'll, you know, maybe we'll talk about that.
Yeah,
later
let's
a
go
little bit
back
more.
and look at some of these icons that we can go back as your heroes, some of the folks that you have influenced you directly and that you look up to.
Well, it was funny when we first came in and started having a conversation about what she was gonna talk about. I was so surprised that she would be saying all that because I'm saying the same thing about people whose mind people start in the 20s, you know, and who were revolutionary. The Carter family, you know, Maybelle and Sarah. I mean, Maybelle like invented that style of guitar playing. She was the first really outstanding lead guitar player, and like Kim was saying, it's only recently that that's being acknowledged.
Sure.
It was always someone else that would get credit for, you know, it was Clarence Ashley that taught Dot Watson or so-and-so, but in the end it was Maybelle Carter's, you know, guitar playing, that bass line run that
absolutely,
that is that whole driving thing that ties the music together. And I mean, how many years ago is that? And just the whole thing of the Carter family they were the first huge country stars, she and Sarah, with AP, but they could never have done that except that Sarah was married to AP and Maybelle was, if you look at all the early really huge stars, they're playing with their husband or their there's a man on the stage with them doing it. They're not like doing it themselves. They played with A.P. Carter, and Mabel was his sister-in-law. You know, they were all related. You know, and the next, Rose Maddox was a huge star, the next really big, huge star that came along in rockabilly, and she played with five brothers. And even though she was the huge star, she was never really given that, except she did start the whole clothing thing. And that's really...
The country music clothing.
Yeah, she was the first person to really do the nudie suit thing. And the first really great flashy ones were made for her. There's all these great books of her with all these famous stars. But she's like disappeared from history in a lot of ways. It's only recently that people are looking back and saying, "Oh wow, Rose Maddox was like invented rockabilly. You know, this is amazing." And Kitty Wells, you know, who Kitty Wells was, you know, is the queen of country music. She had so many huge hits and did everything. But she was married to Jack Wright, and that was really what made it happen. The first one, and it was in the 50s. In 1957, Patsy Cline went on the Arthur Godfrey TV show and won, and she was the first major star to get a contract that wasn't working with her husband or a boyfriend, or she was like the first. She was the first woman who had her name on the bill above the men. That was a really big deal.
I mean, that's Patsy for you.
Yeah. I mean,
maybe working in spite of her husband, if you believe the movie.
Right.
Yeah, right?
Right. You know, and I guess something, what goes around, it's like it never changes. The last person I had on my list of people was a woman named Jackie Ward, who worked with Bascom Lamar Lunsford here. And she did play music, but she never really achieved a lot of fame. Mm-hmm. She played dulcimer, and she and her husband Earl. But she, when Lunsford was running the festival, and there were 15,000 people coming to Asheville for the folk festival, and he got older, it was Jackie Ward that kind of stepped in, and she did it all. She was like as a young musician. I mean, I played the. Not that I'm going to say how old I am, but I think I played the festival for the first time in 79. I was the first woman to place in the guitar competition. And I remember Jackie being so excited that a woman had done that, and not many people remember. So I feel like it's important that be talked about. But it's like, it seems like the more it goes around, the more it stays the same. The whole thing of, if you want to attack a woman, tear her to shreds and say what an evil, bad person she is, and she did this with that guy. But they aren't doing that to the guys, you know, that play. So maybe the more things change, the more they don't. So I was just so surprised to hear you. Everything you said. I thought I was going to come in and you all were going to say, "Oh, things are so much better."
Gosh, I mean, no, I think that they're just different. I think, you know, I know we don't have a ton of time left, but to just sort of touch on something that's interesting to me is that just sort of the progression of music in, you know, from sort of taking where you left off, going into the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. You know, in the 60s and 70s, you had this huge explosion of female songwriting. You know, you had Joni Mitchell, who was putting to light female emotions that were otherwise maybe not being so openly expressed. And then you had Carole King, who was sort of the every woman's woman. She was talking about feelings that every woman could relate to and sort of connect to, and it resonated in their life. And then you move on even further to, you know, the 80s, and you've got women like Joan Jett and Patti Smith, who were sort of the antithesis to this sort of goddess folk singer appeal, and they had more grit and more daring boldness to the way that they approached their work. And then there was this shift, and it's funny because growing up I always sort of wanted to excuse the impact that Madonna had on the music industry for women, and sort of say like, oh yeah, you know, I mean, she's just a blip, you know, there's a million iconic women that come and go, but
she is sex, right?
But she literally, I mean, there's always been a sexuality to women in music, always. But there's always been a sense of demureness, perhaps like a burlesque approach, suggestive behavior without ever really showing anything. And then after Madonna, you notice even on the Rolling Stone magazine covers, which I sent a bunch of photos as time went on with the progression. And, you know, as soon as Britney Spears was on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine in her lingerie, I'm not kidding. There's been 2 women on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine since that haven't been almost fully nude. And it was Alicia Keys on an album cover and Adele. And I mean, you've got Jessica Simpson in a bikini with a vacuum cleaner, and you've got Christina Aguilera fully nude with a guitar covering her frontal area.
She doesn't even play guitar.
She doesn't even play guitar. And so, you know, there's sort of this, and we were talking just before the program about how in the early 90s there was sort of this influx of women writers. You know, you had Tori Amos, and you had Liz Phair, and you had Fiona Apple, and, you know, that was when Ani was really starting to be up and coming. And then I think that Britney was really this antithesis that the music industry offered pop culture, and people grabbed onto it, and it changed women. And for me, that was when she was an icon when I was growing up as a child. And so I can look back at women like Janis Joplin and Ella Fitzgerald, you know, even someone like Doris Day or the Supremes, and I find my influence and my inspiration from them. But it was really difficult growing up in, you know, the early 2000s as a teenager and as a young woman being interested in entering the music industry, feeling like I had a lot to fight for to be able to do what I do now without being exploited. Because just to summarize and wrap it up is just that just because a woman embraces her sexuality does not mean that she's empowered by it if she's still being exploited. And there's still an enormous amount of exploitation in pop music and the mainstream music industry when it comes to women, and they're better than it. And I'm not really sure why they sell themselves so short, but when you've got a woman half-dressed on stage singing a song, it doesn't matter what she's saying, no one's really listening because everybody's too busy looking at what's in front of them. And so I really hope with my band, The Broadcast, and even with other women I meet on the road in music, that we can really be pioneers for a new style of women in music, and to empower ourselves, truly empower ourselves again. It's okay to be sexy. I love to be sexy on stage, but you'll never see me doing it in a bikini or with a striptease, or, you know, you'll never see exploitation attached to it. So I hope to see that in the future of women. I hope to see more Zilphias.
Very well said. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. We didn't get to nearly everyone that we could have, but we're running short on time. So we're going to bid adieu to Kim, Carol, and Caitlin. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Don't go anywhere. We're going to
Thanks,
come back
Joe.
after this local video with more on promotions, publicity, social networking. Stick around for another part of What It Is.